Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this first look at the 2026 British Social Attitude Survey. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and I think as we limp to the end of a pretty extraordinary week in politics, this feels like a very good time to take a breath and focus in on what we now know about what the British public think on a range of really crucial issues facing the country. We have a fantastic panel with us today who are going to take us through this. So we're going to start with Alex Scholes, who is a research director at NatSen and leads the delivery of the British Social Attitudes Survey. We will be followed by Sir John Curtis, who will be very familiar to everybody, a senior research fellow at NatSen, professor of politics at Strathclyde University. And next we will hear from Rob Ford, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester and Senior Fellow at the UK in a Changing Europe. And finally, we'll hear from Nina Scarrow, who is the Chief Executive at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. My name's Helen Barnard, and I am Director of Policy at Trussell. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who is going to start taking us through what we've learned this year about the British public's attitudes.
Great, thanks very much. I'll just try and share my screen now. And then start the presentation. Second. Can you see that first opening slide okay?
Yep, we can see it fine, thanks.
Brilliant. So welcome everyone to the first publication of the British Social Attitudes 43rd report. So I'm going to cover a bit of background on the survey itself, how the most recent BSA was conducted, as well as the latest findings on taxation and spending and welfare. I'll then hand over to John, who will cover the findings on immigration, assisted dying, and electoral reform that we've reported on. So starting with a bit of background on the survey itself, BSA is an annual nationally representative survey of adults in the UK, and NatSen has run the British Social Attitude Survey since 1983, and it's the longest continuous measure of social attitudes in Britain. The BSA First Look is the first of 4 publications we have planned for this year. So in the past, we've published BSA as one annual report in the summer, but this year we're taking a new approach and we'll be producing quarterly outputs based on the data throughout the year. For this publication, what we've tried to do is prioritize those data where we have an existing long-running time series on a question and where we feel the topic covered is one of immediate policy relevance. So the data used for the 43rd report were collected as part of BSA 2025, fieldwork for which was conducted between late August and October last year. And BSA uses a push-to-web design with a telephone option for those who are either unwilling or unable to complete a web survey. So we've operated using that methodology since 2020. Pre-COVID, we operated using face-to-face fieldwork. We sample addresses throughout the whole of the UK from the postcode address file, and then randomly selected addresses are sent a letter inviting up to 2 adults aged 16 and over to take part in the survey. And we've got the household and individual response rates there. Household was around 15% and individual response rate just over 11%. So with the methodology in the background covered, let's move on to these substantive findings, starting with attitudes towards taxation and spending. So BSA has asked, this question of respondents continuously since the survey first began in 1983. Suppose the government had to choose between the following 3 options. Which do you think it should choose? Reduce taxes and spend less on health, education, and social benefits, keep taxes and spending on these services at the same level as now, or increase taxes and spend more on health, education, and social benefits. And this chart shows how the pattern of response has changed since 1983 when we first asked the question. So public attitudes towards taxation and spending are sometimes said to behave thermostatically. In other words, people have a sense of both how much tax they should be paying and what standard of public services they should receive as a result. So when taxes and spending fall, people become concerned about the state of public services and perhaps seek increases in taxation and public spending to address them. Whereas when taxation and spending rise significantly, people began to react against this and desire a reduction in the tax burden. And you can see this pattern in the played out in the chart. So people reacted against the restraints on public expenditure brought in by Conservative governments of 1979 to 1997 by becoming increasingly supportive of increased taxation and spending. And then when public expenditure was expanded under the new Labour government of 1997 to 2010, public opinion then swings back in the opposite direction, only to swing back again when the Conservatives pursued an austerity programme after the financial crash of 2008. So the latest survey is the clearest indication that the public have begun to react against the expansion of the state we've witnessed post-COVID. And in our latest survey, just 36% say the government should increase taxation and spending, and that's the lowest it's been since 2013. And meanwhile, as you can see from the line at the bottom of the chart here, the proportion who think taxation and spending should be reduced has reached an all-time high of 19%. And prior to 2022, that figure never breached the 10% mark. The public has not only reacted thermostatically to the increase in taxation and spending, but attitudes on this issue have actually become more politically polarized as well. So this chart combined parties generally of the right, so Conservatives, UKIP and Reform, and parties of the left, Labour, Lib Dems and Greens, and shows their responses to this question on taxation and spending in 2010, 2022, when we first began to see the signs of a reaction against the post-COVID expansion of the state, and the latest data in 2025. So as would be expected, supporters of parties on the right have always been less supportive of increased taxation and spending than those who support parties of the political left. However, back in 2010, the gap between these two groups was just 12 percentage points. So if you see here, the figures for increase among parties of the right was 24%, whereas for parties of the political left was 36%. By the time we get to the latest data in 2025, there's now a 31 percentage point gap between the two groups, with just 21% of either Conservative, UKIP or Reform voters backing an increase in taxation and spending, compared to around half of Labour, Lib Dems and Greens. So that gap had already widened in 2022. You see a wider gap here in the figures in the top bars. But what is new in 2025 is that there is also a wider polarization in the level of support for reducing taxation and spending. So this was just 5 percentage points in 2022. You can see in the figures at the bottom of the chart here, 10% of supporters of the political right supported reducing taxation and spending, compared with 5% of those on the political left, whereas this has widened to 19 percentage points in our latest survey. So the debate on the size of the state has always been a key dividing line in British politics, but has now become a much more important fault line than it was previously. So moving on from the issue of taxation and spending and towards welfare, BSA has asked respondents since 1987 whether they agree or disagree that the government should spend more money on welfare benefits for the poor, even if that leads to higher taxes. So support for spending additional money on welfare declined around the time New Labour came to power in 1997, and by 2009 around a quarter agreed with this statement. So that was half the proportion when the question was first asked back in 1987. And this changed when the Conservative-led government elected in 2010, reduced the real value of welfare benefits, and then public opinion swung back in the other direction. Our latest data show that the public opinion has now swung back again. So following on from falls in the 2023 and 2024 figures, the proportion who agree that the government should spend more money on welfare has dropped to 27%, an equal all-time low previously recorded in 2009. Meanwhile, the proportion who disagree with the statement is at 42%, and that's the highest it's been since 2009. So increased calls from politicians for a reduction in welfare spending is being matched by a historically high level of concern about the country's welfare spending. The previous question asked broadly about welfare spending for the poor, but what about when we ask people specifically about where they think extra government spending on social benefits should go? This is what this chart shows on screen for BSA data between 2000 and 2025, and certain trends are clear. not least the reduction in support for spending on retirement pensions. So 20 years ago, as many as 61% of people said that would be their highest priority for extra spending. But that figure has since declined steadily, and it stands at just 34% in our latest survey, this figure here. Indeed, it's now not that much more than the 30% recorded for benefits for disabled people, which have been the matter of some controversy and calls for a reduction. And meanwhile, at 29%, the proportion who think extra spending should go on either child benefit or benefit for single parents is at a record high in our latest survey. So the focus we've seen on tightening working age welfare, perhaps to the exclusion of a discussion on spending on pensions, may not really reflect on how the public attitudes have evolved in recent years. So that's the summary of the findings on taxation and spending and welfare. I'll now hand over to John, who will cover the findings on immigration, assisted dying, and electoral reform.
Thank you very much. But Alex will be governing the slides for me. So we move to immigration. This is the pattern of responses to a question which people are asked whether or not the migrants who come to Britain, are they good or bad for the economy? They're asked to answer on a 10-point scale. We simply simplified matters and said that those people who give a score between 0 and 3 are basically saying it's bad. Those who give a score between 7 and 10 think it's largely good. And then we've taken the difference between those two measures. So therefore, if it's a positive figure, more people think it's good than bad, and vice versa. And we're showing you the trend since 2011, which is the length of time during which this question's been asked on British social attitudes, although there are other readings going back another 10 years on the European Social Survey. So point one to note, and perhaps it's one of the paradoxes of the whole Brexit debate, is that whereas indeed well before the Brexit referendum, and indeed if you go look at the data from the previous decade, we were for the most part on balance sceptical about the economic benefits of migration. As the EU referendum came into view, and certainly after the EU referendum, we changed our minds and we decided that actually migration was economically beneficial, perhaps because at least some of those during the referendum debate had been persuaded of the merits of migrants in a way that hadn't previously been the case. But of course, in recent years, the UK has experienced record high levels of migration. Indeed, very, very high levels of migration, 2022, 23, at one point reaching an annual rate of 900,000 a year. And of course, migration has also become something of political agenda, not of course necessarily simply because of the levels of regular migration, but also because of irregular migration, which is a relatively small proportion of the total. So you can see, and perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, that indeed people's perceptions of the economic consequences of migration have now gone back in a reverse direction. And we now have just slightly more people saying that migration is bad for the economy than good, but it's only -1. So I think there are 2 points to make. Well, one is that it does look to be the case that the much higher levels of migration that the UK has been experiencing in recent years, has been continuing to experience, have indeed raised new doubts about whether the migration we're having is beneficial. That said, we're still not back in terms of our skepticism about all of this to where we were 15 years ago, let alone indeed in the first decade of the 21st century. So to that extent, at least, this long view does kind of temper to some degree the extent to which we should assume that migration has suddenly become something to which the British public has become heavily antagonistic, as perhaps to become a little bit more skeptical in the light of more recent experience. Next slide, please. This is doing the same thing for a question not about the economic consequences of migration, but the cultural consequences. It asks people whether or not they think that migrants who come to Britain either enrich Britain's culture or whether they undermine it. They get into some of the cultural debates about migration that perhaps particularly Reform have tended to focus on. The data is collected in the same way. I've summarized it in the same way. And basically, the story is largely the same. So as we get approaching and beyond the referendum, more people began to say that migration enriched our culture rather than undermined it. But more recently, we've had more in the way of migration. And of course, one of the ironies of Brexit, we now have rather more culturally diverse migration than was the case when we were inside the European Union. And we can see that, again, there has been a similar reaction of a similar scale. Okay, next slide, please. But again, in a story that is not dissimilar to that on taxation and spending, the reaction of the public has not been uniform, and the change of attitude has not been uniform. Again, we're doing very similar analysis to tax and spending. So we're looking, first of all, the picture back at 2011, which is the first year when we collected data on BSA on this on the questions of the economy and culture, and where, broadly speaking, we were pretty skeptical about the benefits. Then we've got the data for 2022, when we were still, for the most part, thinking it was a good thing. And then we've got the data for 2025, when you've seen that basically we are split at 50-50. Now, if you go back to 2011, yes, parties like the Conservative Party, UKIP and Reform, again, we've put those parties together, were on balance, supporters of those parties were less likely to think that migration was good for the economy and less likely to think that more likely to think it undermined our culture, whereas Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green supporters took a fairly balanced view. So there was a gap, but it wasn't an enormous gap. By the time we got to 2022, well, the Conservative and UKIP and Reform supporters, such as they were at that stage, were kind of evenly balanced on the issue, so they had shifted their view. But those who were supporting Labour, etc., they had definitely of a different view than 11 years previously. And you can see that the gap had already widened up. They were saying, yes, these in effect, were the folk who on balance were saying that migration was good for us. But now we've got a position where, on the one hand, yes, there's been some reaction amongst those who support Labour, etc., but it's a much weaker reaction than it is amongst those who support the Conservatives and Reform. And effectively now the parties or the party's supporters are now polarized on migration in a way that was not evident when attitudes were as similar to what they were now in terms of society as a whole. Okay, next slide, please. So we now move on to a subject which is not the subject of party political controversy, but it's a subject where has been the subject of very considerable public debate during the course of the last 12 months, because both the UK Parliament has been considering legislation for England and Wales, while at the same time the Parliament in Edinburgh has been considering legislation for Scotland on whether or not the law should allow assisted dying. The two bills are, broadly speaking, similar in that they essentially say that the law should allow a doctor to give somebody who is terminally ill and who has been determined is of sound mind and really has made their mind up that they no longer wish to live. The bills then say the doctor should indeed be allowed to give the person a drug that they administer for themselves. The first question we've asked here, which we've asked, as you will see, over a 30-year period, doesn't match the bills exactly, but it's relatively close. You could argue it might allow the possibility of the doctor administering the dose, but it's basically talking about, should we permit assisted dying in a circumstance where somebody has a terminal illness? We've also, however, as it happens, have also been asking on a regular basis a similar scenario, but where somebody doesn't have a terminal illness, simply something that is incurable or painful, and they wish to end their lives. Next slide, please. So these are the data across the British survey has registered over time. So this, for the time being, includes Scotland. And as you can, and this is looking at the scenario where the person is terminally ill. A couple of points to make. The first is that the debate in the last 12 months has had absolutely no impact on the balance of public opinion. 78% of people said that it should or probably be allowed. and 79% say so now. So although we've had this substantial debate, public opinion already seems to have reached a settled view on the subject. Indeed, public opinion has not really shifted during the course of the last 30 years. We'll come back to some of the implications of that in a moment. Next slide, please. What about the non-terminal scenario? Well, it is true if we go back to the mid-1990s when we first asked this, on balance, people said it should not be allowed. But as you can see, gradually over time, actually public opinion has begun willing. It's still not as supportive as is the terminal scenario, but the balance of public opinion has actually shifted also to being willing to contemplate assisted dying for a non-terminal scenario as well. So to that extent, at least, public opinion has shifted. Next slide, please. What about, is it the case that attitudes in Scotland are different from those in England and Wales? Is there a case for having different legislation on the two sides of the border so far as public opinion is concerned? Short answer, no. The fascinating thing, of course, therefore, about this legislation, whatever view you take on it, and clearly people have very, very strong views on both sides of the argument, is that at the time when, for example, we got rid of the death penalty, when we had homosexual law reform, and indeed, frankly, even when we had civil recognition of partnerships, the state was either moving ahead of or certainly no more quickly than public opinion. In this case, the truth is, if the bills were to go through, and you will all know about the challenges they both face, if they were to go through, it looks as though actually legislators would be acknowledging a public mood that has been there for a very long time. And to that extent, at least, the backdrop to a change of the law is very different. Okay, finally, next slide, please. The electoral system, very, very quickly. This is a question that we have been asking over the course, again, over the last 40 years. It asks people whether or not we should change the electoral system in order to ensure that small parties get a fair share of seats, or whether we should keep it because it provides effective government. Historically, as the red line shows, we have been inclined to back the current electoral system if the question is asked in that way. But things began to shift during the course of the last Parliament. And actually, in the immediate wake of the 2024 general election, for the first time, the supporters of all parties, even Conservative supporters, more of them said they were in favour of change than not. There has been a bit of a shift back since, but not very much. We are still looking at a public that we're now facing a very different party system that perhaps is more keener on electoral reform. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we've had a reaction. We've seen how the public have reacted to the increased size of the state on taxation and spending, particularly with respect to welfare, and the increased scale of immigration. But it's not always been a uniform reaction. We are also talking about a society that on taxation, spending and immigration is now more divided and polarized. Meanwhile, there is continuing new questioning of the first past the post system, though it may not have yet reached Westminster. And in contrast to these very substantial changes in public opinion we've charted, well, one thing where public opinion doesn't seem to have shifted at all, even though it's been the subject of considerable debate, is on assisted dying.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex and John. That was fascinating. Now, I think some of you have already found we have a Q&A function. So if you want to pop questions in the Q&A for us to put to John and Alex or to our panelists once you've heard them speak, please pop them in there. We will get through as many as we can. Now, I'm going to come first to you, Rob, to get your reflections on the views that we're seeing on immigration and the ways that those have been shifting. You're on mute.
Thank you, Helen. Sorry, trying to find the mute button. So I wanted to sort of group my reflections together around three headings. I think lags, salience, and polarization. So the first thing that I found very interesting in these latest findings is that they show the trend of the last few years has continued in the latest data in terms of attitudes have, in response to a big wave of immigration recently, shifted in a more negative direction. They're not all the way back to how negative they were in the early 2010s when net migration was considerably lower than it is now. However, there are a number of lags in all of this, which raise some interesting questions in terms of what exactly it is the public is responding to. So we know already from the latest published migration statistics that this so-called Boris wave of migration that hit in sort of 2021 through 23 is already receding. Net migration levels fell very sharply in 2024. They're still high by historical standards, but much lower than they were a couple of years before. Those are very likely to fall further when we get more migration statistics. So they are very likely amongst the lowest that we've seen in 20 years in terms of the conditions that were prevalent on the ground when people were answering this survey in 2025. But as yet, it doesn't seem that opinion has responded to that, which suggests it isn't just the direct experience of migration that's informing this, but also the indirect, the mediated experience of migration, mediated through reporting of statistics, mediated through political debate about the issue and everything, which introduces lots of lags. We know that the overall inflows are going to go down. What we don't know is when and whether the public will respond to that. The second point to make is about salience. So one thing that's very striking in the overall distribution of the public is that it is in fact three roughly evenly sized slices at the moment. There's a slice that is negative, there's a slice that is positive, and there's a slice that's kind of neutral, not sure, neither negative nor positive. I think we hear an awful lot about the slice that is negative, both from them and about them, and not so much about the other two slices. In fact, I think if you were to ask the average man on the street what they think the average man on the street's opinion of immigration is, they would say that it's negative, because that's the group we hear about. Now, that isn't entirely by accident, because there's a really big asymmetry in the salience of immigration for different groups of voters. Broadly speaking, the group that don't like immigration, it really matters to them that they don't like immigration, and getting immigration down is a top priority for them. Indeed, if you look at Reform UK voters, for example, it is the overwhelming political priority of that group, and that's the party leading the polls. If you look at voters who are positive about immigration or indifferent about immigration, it's just not an issue on the agenda for them in the same way. And that means that although the overall distribution of opinion is quite nuanced, the distribution of sort of vocalized and mobilized opinion is not. The people who get exercised about immigration, organize around it, and seek to change policy on it are almost all from one of those three groups, the group that doesn't like immigration, which tends to introduce a skew into the debate as the issue is carried on in politics, as opposed to what it actually looks like in terms of the distribution of opinion. Not entirely unfairly, I would say, because it's natural for politicians to want to respond to the issues that voters are exercised about most, and this is a substantial group, and they are exercised about this issue. And that brings us to the third point, which is polarization. This is where I think the landscape on the issue has changed perhaps the most now compared to 15 years ago. I mean, attitudes are a little bit less negative than then, but what is different is the Labour Party of 2011, the Labour Party of 2005, there were very good political incentives for wanting to keep on board that anti-immigration group, the group of voters who say that immigration has lots of negative impacts, because that was a substantial slot of your electorate. That is not the case currently. Instead, the voters have sorted around the issue of immigration and a number of other issues too, in such a way that there is a substantial risk to the Labour government of today that in saying things that essentially sympathise with voters sceptical about immigration, they kind of shoot themselves in the foot a bit, because they antagonise the average Labour voter who tends, as John shows, to be strongly pro-immigration, but they're never going to be sufficiently anti-immigration to be credible with the average Conservative or Reform voter, who, as we saw, is very strongly anti-immigration. So they end up falling into a no man's land where they don't really please anybody at all, which is a very different political conundrum to the one that their predecessors would have. about 20 years ago. Not necessarily a very easy one to solve, but what we can see in the polling in the last few years is that Labour have lost a lot more votes on their left flank than their right flank. And that might well reflect the fact that although pro-immigration voters don't prioritise the issue and make a lot of noise about it, they won't necessarily take kindly to a party they voted for consistently saying and doing things on an issue that are at odds with what they would prefer. And that's it. That's my 3 reflections.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rob. Lots to come back to there with questions. But first, I want to turn to Nina and particularly think about the findings on tax and spend. Where do you think this leaves us?
Great. Thanks very much, Helen. So the big headline findings, as we heard from Alex and John in this area, is that the public support for lowering taxes and spending is at an all-time high, with around 1 in 5 people now supporting that course of action. And secondly, is that attitudes towards tax and spend have become increasingly polarized. So on this, I'd like to offer 2 main reflections. So firstly, to point out that the size of the state has increased quite significantly. So just how much? So if we think back to 2000, public sector receipts were equivalent to around 36% of GDP. In COVID, just pre-COVID, 2019, that rose to about 37%. And for the year just ended, that is now standing at above 39%. And if you're thinking, well, that difference in a 25-year time span between 36% and 39% isn't actually that big, that's 3 percentage points, but of the entire UK economy. So that is actually a massive difference. And that period of the expansion of the state has coincided with, I would say, a both real and a perceived deterioration in the provision of public services. And understandably, this overlap has led a lot of people to consider the efficiency with which government is using public money. So essentially, I think a lot of people are asking themselves, is the UK government giving me good bang for my buck? And increasingly, a lot of people are saying, well, no. And now in the 2010s, very much in the austerity period, if somebody had either a personal negative experience with public services, let's say you needed a surgery, you were put on a 6-month-long wait list, you went to sign up your child at a school, you were told that places were oversubscribed. Or if you were reading the news and you read in the news that some train stations are having to be closed down over the weekend due to lack of staffing, a lot of people, I think, would take those personal and secondhand experiences and think, well, that's the cost we need to pay. It's austerity. The government is saving money. They're not spending money. So we need to accept some of these shortcomings. But now, if people have a negative experience, or they read in the news that a lot of other people are having a negative experience, they think, well, hold on, I know that I'm paying more in taxes. I've heard in the news that the tax burden is at a record high in modern history. So there really is no excuses, which I think is what has pushed a lot of people to express these kinds of opinions. Now, secondly, on the point of polarization, I'm not surprised that in the UK, different groups of people feel very differently about taxation. And why that actually might be the case more so in the UK than in a range of other advanced economies. So relative to a lot of comparable countries, the big taxes in the UK, the likes of income tax, they are very progressive, meaning that the taxation burden sits much more heavily on a more concentrated group of people. Now, I don't, in my sort of remaining 3 minutes, not enough time to discuss whether that's a good or a bad thing. Like most things, there's pros and there is cons. But it does mean that smaller pockets of the population are going to have very different experiences of the taxation system. So to put some figures to that, top earners in the UK will see about 45% of their earnings go towards taxes and social contributions. For the average earner, that figure is around 29%. So that gap between what are the top earners and the average earners contributing, it's about 16 percentage points. And that's quite a big gap. So if we look at some comparable countries, in Australia, in France, it's around 9-10 percentage points. In the US, it's as low as 7 percentage points. So I do think this is worth keeping in mind. And it's also very much worth highlighting that this hasn't always been the case. It's been the case for about a decade and a half. And with the more recent freezing in various tax thresholds, this can become even more pronounced, even more underlined. So that's what I mean when I say I'm not surprised that a different group of people will have increasingly polarized views of the taxation system, because in some ways the system is genuinely polarized and has become increasingly polarized over time. So very briefly, what do these changing attitudes, what does this leave me to believe in terms of the economic outlook? Is that the UK, although not facing sort of an immediate fiscal crisis, could be on the precipice of a turning point. The combination of a larger state, a more concentrated taxation system, and declining satisfaction with public services would suggest that we're in a pretty fragile equilibrium. And I think the only answer to this, because the state is probably about as big as it can get, and we're seeing that in these attitudes as well, there is decreasing appetite for a bigger state. I think really the only answer is growth and generating economic growth. And that might seem obvious, but actually it's not something that we've heard a lot about from the current government. Their focus has definitely been on the taxation front. So I think that will be sort of the not easy, but the really necessary answer.
Great, thank you very much, Nina. Again, I think there will be lots of questions to get into about that. Before we go to the questions and the Q&A, I was just going to give a couple of reflections on particularly the welfare findings. And for me, there are two things I think that stood out on that. I think the first is we are seeing this turning of public opinion away from support for social security overall. And I think it's interesting we're seeing that after a period of years where we've seen a very sharp increase in hardship, in hunger, in food bank need, largely driven by an inadequate social security system. So that disjuncture between how people are experiencing it on the ground and what the public's views are feels quite stark. I think the second thing, though, is that very striking changing pattern about the priority groups for support. And in particular, this big fall in the idea that pensions should be the top priority for spending, social spending. And actually now spending to support disabled people and families is becoming almost even. And that feels very at odds with the political discourse, which is still in a place where you cannot touch even kind of rhetorically support for older people, for pensions, for the triple lock. And there has been a very big focus on cutting spending on support for disabled people. So I think it's interesting that the public and politicians seem to be in a different place, and whether that gives politicians perhaps more space than they might believe they have to have a conversation about how much resources are going into the pension system versus the working age system. And I will come to some of our panelists for reflections on that as well. But I want to start now with some questions. We're getting lots of questions now in the chat, in the Q&A. Thank you very much. The first question I want to come to is actually going back to the electoral reform question, and a question I think probably for John around the views of Labour supporters. Has the change in views on electoral reform since the general election of 2024 landslide, how does that compare with how views changed after the 1997 general election landslide? Is there a contrast there?
I don't have the data for 1997 immediately in front of me, but certainly more broadly, what is the case, and in a sense it's there from the headline data, is that although in some respects the history of the Labour Party and electoral reform in the last few years is very similar to that through to 1997. So for people who don't remember, the Labour Party in the 1992-97 Parliament got Raymond Plant to head up a commission, and that came out, broadly speaking, in favour of changing the system. And Labour promised a commission on the subject that was subsequently held and headed by Roy Jenkins, which did recommend a change to a somewhat more proportional system. We were meant then to have a referendum on those recommendations, but curiously, it all got forgotten about because, of course, in the meantime, the Labour Party, having lost confidence in the electoral system to deliver electoral success, managed to win a majority of 170 odd in 1997. But my memory is, and I'm pretty sure this is right, that there wasn't that much of a shift amongst Labour voters prior to the 1997 election, in a way that has been very clearly the case in the 2019 to 2024 Parliament. And it's in that Parliament, and it's around 2022, 2023, that for the first time, more Labour supporters were saying that they were in favour of reform than were against. Now, of course, it's roughly around the time when, again, the Labour Party in the 2022 conference voted in favour of changing the electoral system, not without having any referendum or a commission. They were just voted in favour of changing the electoral system, so much less ambiguous. But the leadership at that point made it clear it wasn't in favour. It wasn't in the Labour manifesto. And of course, in the meantime, the Labour Party has won another majority of 170, one that arguably that psephologically has a very different character and leaves Labour much more vulnerable, but that's a story for another day. So far as where we are at now, basically support for reform amongst Labour supporters in the immediate wake of the general election, it stood at 55%. So they were, despite the immediate success, you still had a majority in favour. That proportion has slipped. It's slipped to 50%. Okay, but you still got a half of Labour supporters. But of course, whatever rose-tinted view they have of the 2024 election, the last 18 months, shall we say, has presented them with a now different political challenge, which might mean that you might still want to wonder about the system. As far as I've got the system, of course, we might then ask the question about reform, given they're now ahead. Have they changed their views? Yes, to a degree. 61% of them are still in favour, but 79% were in favour after the 2024 election. Conservative supporters have a little bit recovered from the shock of the 2024 election. The proportion who are in favour of reform has slipped from 52 to 44, but it's still, by historical standards, very high. The Liberal Democrats do seem, for the most part, to be hanging on to the faith, even though the electoral system proved to be highly advantageous to them for the first time in 100 years. In 2024, we've still got 60% of them saying they're in favour. So the truth is there's been small movements among all the parties, and in some respect movement against, but it's still, we're still have got substantial bodies of voters, irrespective of the party they support, saying we should change the electoral system.
Great, thank you very much, John. Now, I'm going to come to Rob. We've had some questions around what is driving the immigration attitudes, particularly the hardening of attitudes towards immigration. And I think a couple of questions. One, so the fact that negative attitudes are hardening despite immigration falling. Question, could that be because there is a lag in people experiencing the effects of immigration and therefore they're reacting to that? And then a kind of broader question, do you think that the drivers of this shift are people's direct experience in their areas, the discourse, political rhetoric? What do you think is playing into this most strongly?
Well, I think I'll start with the second one because it informs the first one. The answer to the question, what's driving these attitudes? Is it direct experience? Is it media discourse? Is it political discourse? The answer is yes. It is all of those things in some mixed and uncertain combination. With a topic as complex as immigration, I mean, this incidentally is also true for many of the other topics discussed in this hour. The public's aggregate view is the product of a hugely complex set of different influences. So it's hard to say for certain what exactly is driving this. There's a lot of things in play. And then on the question of the lags, yeah, I saw in the Q&A somebody had said, well, could this not be, that if immigration was very, very high in 22, 23, people are still experiencing the effects of that? I think that's absolutely true, and that's a fair point. I probably should have raised that point in my initial comments. Of course, the experiences of immigration on the ground aren't registered at the same point as the migrant arrives in the statistics. They last. That said, though, there are some problems with an argument that suggests that what's driving this is, the impacts flowing through. The first is, why on earth did attitudes shift so strongly in a positive direction in the sort of period running up to and immediately after Brexit, even though immigration levels didn't change at all in that period? If anything, they went up a bit. And why also do we not see at the regional or local or neighbourhood level really any association whatsoever between levels of immigration flows and views about immigration? In fact, if there is any kind of statistical association, and a lot of this really is compositional, but nonetheless, areas with high levels of immigration tend on balance to be more positive about immigration than areas with very little immigration. Now, I don't think there's a straightforward story about that. I'm not saying that therefore it's all mediated. That's not true either. One of the reasons is that many of the people who live in diverse high immigration areas are either themselves immigrants or come from the kinds of groups that like immigration, like young people, graduates, and so on. So a lot of that is compositional. I see John's nodding. So it's a complicated story, in short, and I think more complicated than either the pro or the anti-immigration camp would prefer. The anti-immigration camp's narrative would be simply immigration is bad for people's lives, it damages their prospects, it makes their housing more expensive, it brings their wages down, and that's why they don't like it. Well, that's not really easy to square in a simple way with what the data say. But the pro-immigration camp tend to the view that all of this is sort of concocted by malevolent actors in the media, and people are being misled, and actually there are really no negative impacts from immigration at all. I don't really think that argument stacks up with the data either. I mean, in a way, the last few years have been a stress test of that argument. We had a really large and completely unexpected surge in immigration, and the public responded by saying, well, this is really too much. I think that's a perfectly reasonable and rational response, even if the details of it are messy and complicated. In the aggregate, the public seems to be responding in a way that makes a good deal of sense, although it does have to be hashed out.
Great, thank you, Rob. John, did you want to come in on that, or were you nodding in?
No, I was nodding in agreement. Absolutely fine.
Deeply reassuring. Now I want to come to Nina now. It's a really interesting question around the tax and spend, and also around economic growth. Do you think there are ways in which economic growth could genuinely be significantly raised within one parliament to try and help the government out of this bind they're in with creaking public services, but people not wanting to pay more tax?
Right. So, I mean, I think the sooner you start trying, the sooner you will see results. It's a well-recognized problem in economics and political economy that an economic cycle is longer than an electoral cycle, which notoriously leads to probably suboptimal outcomes. Having said that, are there ways to support growth? Could there be more growth? I think the answer is just unquestionably yes. And why do I think the answer is absolutely yes? Is because there are other countries who have faced similar challenges, who have gone through COVID, who are facing aging populations, who have seen the declines in heavy industry. A lot of these challenges are not unique to the UK. And they are seeing and have seen a better economic performance. So I don't think that, this sort of very low growth trajectory is set in stone. And I actually take a lot of optimism from the findings that we've just been discussing in terms of the attitudes that people are expressing, because I think what this is showing, I don't think this is people saying we want magic, we want the government to deliver more for less. I actually think what we're seeing is the public becoming more discerning and saying, well, hold on, you have grown the size of the state. We're not seeing very much growth. We're not seeing great provision of public services. we expect more, and I think that's a perfectly valid thing to come. And the reason that I say I'm actually encouraged by that is I think sort of a soft measure that, as an economist, it's kind of difficult to put a number to it and then build it into like a macroeconomic forecasting model. But I think a really important measure of in the medium term is on questions like, is there going to be growth? How is a country going to do? Is the population sensible? Are they going to be asking the right questions of their government? And I think what we've been discussing here actually is really encouraging. The public is asking the right questions. Yes, there can be growth. Can there be growth before the end of this parliament? Probably some, but probably looking beyond that time horizon is needed as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nina. And another question on tax and spend, which I was going to come to you with, Alex. So a question, as public support for overall taxation falls, is there any data around whether voters favour raising specific taxes on particular groups rather than the kind of general taxation questions that we've seen?
Not on BSA, no. We don't ask about specific taxes or, get into that level of detail. It's just a broad question on whether you think taxes should be increased, kept the same, or reduced. We do specify what the spending would go on health, education, or social benefits, but I'm afraid we don't have the data on those specific questions now.
Can I just follow up though slightly, Helen, because there's a kind of link between that question and some of Nina's very interesting comments. And in particular, Nina was arguing that she wasn't surprised at the polarization given the strongly progressive nature of the UK tax system. And that would therefore seem to give a reason to believe that voters in different circumstances might take different views. This is not what she said, so I may be slightly misdirecting my comments, but one possible interpretation of her comments, and she may want to come back to me on this, is that, well, therefore, perhaps people who are particularly well off are the ones who perhaps have most to object to about the current state of taxation and spending. But then the curious thing is, of course, is that the polarization we have identified is a political one between, on the one hand, Conservative and Reform supporters, on the other, Labour, Liberal Democrat and Green supporters. And then we have to bear in mind that of all our political parties, the party that is most popular, relatively speaking, amongst those from a working class background who tend to be less well off, is Reform. And that support for the Conservative Party is certainly no higher amongst middle class people than amongst working class people. Oh, by the way, the same is true of the Labour Party, and the Liberal Democrats tend to be relatively middle class. So the polarization, the political polarization we've got, doesn't map onto a demographic division of the kind that says, well, therefore it must be the folk who are paying a lot of tax who are particularly rebelling.
That's really interesting. Thank you, John. Nina, did you want to come back on that, or should we?
Yeah, that is a really interesting observation. I do think the exception rather than the rule is the reform cohort. I think also I think sometimes people themselves they have a higher level of sensitivity to particular taxes, which isn't always very logically aligned with how likely they are to pay that particular tax. Mm-hmm. So something like inheritance taxes is a really sensitive topic, which wouldn't necessarily be supported by how likely people are to be impacted by that. So yeah, definitely acknowledge that there can be a mismatch between how people stand to be impacted, and that it's not sort of a perfect overlap. I think actually this does also tie into one of the questions you mentioned, Helen, and I saw in the Q&A, and somebody kind of brought up are people's views being impacted around the government's sort of rhetoric and everything they were saying around the budget about the types of taxes that need to rise, just in general, what's necessary. And I think from all of that, from the fact that people are sometimes supporting taxes or lack of taxes that are against their own personal interest, from these very changing, complex opinion. I think one takeaway is that the government, I mean, honestly, the government, but also probably the opposition parties, probably need to be a little bit savvier with their communications. And if it is a case of, are these opinions we're seeing now, were they driven heavily by the sort of communications around budget time? If you make that link, well, then the takeaway is that the government did not do a very good job of communicating what it needs to be doing. Because if anything, they were trying to send the message of the state needs to get bigger, the job is not done, trust us more with more of your money. So if the response from the public has been hold off, no, we're actually becoming increasingly skeptical. There's definitely a big missing link there, and kind of making people understand of what part of your economic activity are going to be taxed, which of the parties is supporting what. I think there is a big sort of missing link there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to end just by coming to ask the three of you about the drivers of polarization, because it's perhaps one of the strongest striking themes across this whole release has been the polarization we're now seeing being so much greater than it ever used to be. So there's a question about what is driving that. So is it partly about media consumption? And somebody saying previously BSA has suggested that if you get your news mainly from social media, that's associated with more extreme attitudes to left and right. Is it about real differences in people's experiences? Is it about politicians' rhetoric becoming more polarizing? So I'm going to come perhaps first to you, Rob. What do you think is driving some of the polarization?
Well, whereas my previous answer was all of the above, my at the risk of gross oversimplification, answer to start with on that is none of the above. I think the three things you've named there are all epiphenomenal. In fact, the structural changes that have been going on here and are going on in pretty much every developed democracy in the world are a fragmentation in party systems, a de-anchoring of voting behavior, the loss of traditional tribal political attachments, and the growing linkage of political attitudes and behavior to new structural divisions in society, divisions around age and generation, divisions around ethnicity and identity, and divisions around education. We used to live in a world, very simply, broad brush speaking, of class divisions and class politics, two classes, two politics, and economic divides being primary. These days it's much more complicated. Economic divides are still important. Inequalities still matter. But a whole bunch of other stuff has now been thrown into the mix too. Many of the things that fall under the heading of Brexit. What defines a leaver or a remainer? It's much more about your age and your education level and your views about national identity and immigration than it is about your social class and so on. So this isn't about people looking at Twitter and going nuts, quite frankly. It's about much deeper changes in our society and the divisions that exist within it that then get and reinforced through things like Twitter, through things like new political parties and so on. But those are about how those things get mobilized into the political argument rather than being the original sources of division in the first place.
Thank you, Rob. And just very quickly, last word from you, John, about what is driving this polarization.
Rob is spot on. You're essentially talking about not necessarily people becoming more antagonistic to each other, but that people's views are, I mean, our politics has become much more a politics of niche markets, and people are occupying the niche market that reflects their views. I'll just end on one thing, which means not in here. For example, if you want to understand reform, the one thing you need to know is that support for reform stands at 50% amongst those people who voted for Brexit, and it's less than 10% amongst those who voted Remain. This is a party that is reflecting a niche market of social and conservative people who voted for Brexit. It's a big enough market to command 30%. Whether it's big enough to command more than that is debatable. But then we have to remember, all of our parties now are minorities. We have moved away from the era of large, dominant two-party politics to a politics of niche markets, of multi-party fragmentation, and that is almost undoubtedly bound to be associated with a greater degree of political polarization, i.e. the match between attitudes and the party you vote for.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that gives us the right framing to go into the next few months, which are going to be very telling, particularly in terms of the reform, how far the reform vote gets. So I want to just end by thanking all of you for coming and for all your brilliant questions. Apologies we haven't got through all of them, but hopefully some of the BSA work that's coming out in the blogs will answer more. So thank you to the BSA team, to NatSen's team, who have done all of this amazing work and put this event on. And finally, thank you to our panelists, Rob, John, Alex, and Nina, for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. It has been a fascinating way to spend lunchtime, and hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ellen.